Most of us have a strong belief about our own species that human beings are fundamentally selfish and greedy. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? Just watch the news or look at how our politicians and business leaders behave. Selfishness and greed, unfortunately, are what humans are all about. But weirdly, the science tells us nothing of the kind. Study after study, experiment after experiment, shows that while we all have some selfishness and greed in us, these are not our dominant values. In the great majority of people, empathy, kindness, community spirit are all stronger values. It turns out that we have a distorted view of human behavior. We have a powerful instinct to look out for danger, so the bad things people do are more salient in our minds than the good things. The news reinforces this tendency. If it bleeds, it leads. When we remember the 2 terrorists who murdered 12 people in Paris in January 2015, we tell ourselves humans are fundamentally evil. But we forget the 3 million people in France and the millions elsewhere who gathered, lit candles, and marched in solidarity with the victims. These people represent the human norm, not the 2 terrorists. We stand together against threats to our well-being. As for our leaders, well, they turn out to be highly unusual, and not in a good way. They're more likely than most people to be selfish and greedy, which is perhaps how they got to where they are. But they dominate the TV screens and they fill our minds, so we think, oh, that's what we're like. Broadly speaking, we're a society of altruists dominated by selfish people. The reality this obscures would make us gasp if we saw it in another species. Only because it's so familiar do we fail to notice that kindness is central to the human condition. Every day, I see people helping others with luggage, letting people into a queue of traffic, giving money to the homeless, listening to friends in distress, volunteering for causes which offer no material reward. And this isn't reciprocity. When you give money to a homeless person, you don't expect them to give you money back. Occasionally, we risk everything for the sake of other people. I think of my Dutch mother-in-law, whose family, during the German occupation, took in a 6-year-old Jewish boy, a complete stranger, and kept him in their house for 2 years. Fed him and everything as well. The house next door was occupied by the local German commandant. The street was often thick with soldiers and officials. Had the boy been discovered, the whole family would have been sent to a concentration camp where they're likely to have been murdered. And they weren't alone. Thousands of Dutch families did the same. The ideology that dominates our lives tells us that what we want to do above all else is elbow other people out of the way to grab wealth and power for ourselves. And it tells us this is a good thing. Through intense competition and extreme individualism, society becomes divided into winners and losers, and the winners make the money that trickles down to enrich everyone else. It's not just that it doesn't work out like this, as the winners tend to grab other people's wealth, but the whole worldview is based on a fallacy. It's simply not how most people behave. Knowing what we now know about human nature, we need a new politics, based on the knowledge that we're fundamentally empathetic and kind. We need to rebuild community life and allow communities to regain real political and economic power, an approach I call the politics of belonging. We stand together or we fall apart.
Thank you so much, George Monbiot. And you can hear George's essay again on the BBC Radio 2 website. Your chosen track today is Such a Thing as Society, which is co-written by George and Ewan McLennan and sung by Ewan McLennan. We might talk about this in a moment.
This, my friend, is the time-honored lie. This, my friend, is the time-honored lie. There is such a thing as society. It keeps us from losing our minds. It's working and living and laughing together that makes us humankind.
Such a Thing as Society, and that is Ewan McLennan, but also George Monbiot with him, our guest today. And we should ask about that song first of all, because the phrase "Such a Thing as Society" harks back to Mrs. T, does it not?
It does, yeah. Where she said, "There's no such thing as society. There's just men and women and their families," and this was about as far removed from the truth as you could possibly get. We are, with the possible exception of the naked mole rat, the supreme social mammals, in that we just simply can't cope without other people. This
Is the naked mole rat an important diversion for us? Shall we ask about?
Well, the naked mole rat's extraordinary because it's what they call a eusocial mammal, which means it behaves like bees and wasps, and it has a queen who produces all the babies, and her sisters bring up the babies. So it's really weird. It's just like one of the social insects, but it's a mammal. So it is a diversion. But
no, but it's fascinating.
It's fascinating.
But you think we are naturally like that, do you?
Well, we don't do the eusocial bit, but yeah, we are way out there in terms of our connectedness with other people. It's why solitary confinement is such an effective form of torture. We just cannot cope without other people. And yet we're faced with this age of loneliness in which 7 billion people on Earth and loads of people without a single confidant. You know, the number of American men in one survey without anyone they could call a confidant nearly tripled in 2 decades.
Right, and by the way, that song, it's interesting because you went on tour with a whole load of songs to basically sing as a way of getting lonely people together.
Yeah. Well, I'd written this article about what I call the age of loneliness in The Guardian, and it went completely berserk. It went massively viral. And so I had these publishers said, write a book about it. I thought, yeah, great. Yeah, 3 years sitting on my backside writing about loneliness. What's the second prize? So, but then I thought, well, music, that's what brings people together. So I got together with you and this wonderful musician, and we wrote this concept album called Breaking the Spell of Loneliness, and we toured it. And everywhere we did a gig, we did a party on the back of the gig. First of all, we forced people to sing together. Then we forced people to talk to a stranger, to say hello to a stranger. And then we found we couldn't shut them up. We broke that British reserve. We broke through. And it turns out that people were just waiting for permission. People are desperate to talk. And then we would spill over into a bar or a pub and spend the rest of the evening chatting. And it worked amazingly well.
You have what we used to be called a social conscience, and that's evident from everything that you say and do. But your parents are conservative, so they were. I mean, it would be absolutely logical for you to have become Thatcherite, right wing, etc. Why not?
Well, when I turned up at university, I had a sort of amalgam of their views and other stuff, and I was a very argumentative person. I still am, as you know, and I tried to argue those views. I kept losing the arguments. There's one thing I really hate is losing an argument, and so I tried arguing it a different way, and I'd still lose the argument, and again, and still lose it, and then I twigged that maybe the position is faulty. Maybe there's something wrong. And so I really sort of went about it from first principles. I said, I'm going to sort of strip all this down. And so if I had visited from an alien planet, what would I see here? And I began to realize that just about everything I'd been led to believe, not just by my parents, but at school too, just didn't stack up at all.
And fundamentally, it's the idea that markets drive us, that we're driven by, I suppose, a form of selfishness. We want a better car and we want a better house. And if we lock all of that together, it's an incredibly powerful drive. That is true, isn't it?
Well, we all have that in us, and it would be foolish to deny that we don't. But it's that small aspect of our being which has been magnified, amplified massively by the political circumstances, by the rhetoric was constantly thrown at us, saying this is your destiny in life, is basically to trample down everyone else. And economists have produced this notion called Homo economicus, which describes that person, someone who's just trying to grab all the wealth and power. And there was a lovely article I came across in the journal Frontiers in Psychology, which says Homo economicus is a fine description of chimpanzees. It's basically this is how they operate. You know, if a chimpanzee gets a novel food source, they will fight off all comers, including their own children. If a stranger chimpanzee turns up in your troop, they're quite likely to have their arms torn off. But we don't behave like this at all. And the paper went on to say it's a completely ridiculous description of human beings because we are these supreme cooperators. And the way we survived, you know, we evolved in the savannas where we were the slowest and weakest of all the large mammals, surrounded not just by the scary creatures that live in the African savannas today, but there was an otter the size of a lion. There were massive bear dogs. There were giant hyenas. There were loads of really terrifying things. And yet, we not only survived, we came out on top. And the only way we were able to do that was by being the supreme cooperators, was by basically making sure that everything we did together, and that while the animals coming at us might have been very scary, they were coming at us alone, and we were coming back at them in numbers.
Now, when you got to Oxford University, I think you were this period of sort of thinking about your beliefs and everything. You came out of the university as an immensely intrepid person. I mean, you were doing things in your early 20s that most people would have found terrifying. How did you start? How did that come to you?
A death wish gets you a long way in life. So I started, the only proper job I've ever had in my life was with the BBC Natural History Unit, where I bashed down their doors, and I was actually told by the boss, "You're so effing persistent, I've got no choice but to give you this job." Because it was the one thing I wanted to do was to make environmental investigative programs. And for a couple of years I did that, and it went tremendously well. But then the BBC was severely disciplined. The Director General, Alistair Milne, was sacked. And on that morning, I was told by my boss, "We've had the memo, no more investigative programs across the network." So what am I going to do? That's all I ever wanted to do. But I'd come across this great story, terrifying, horrifying story, but from the journalistic point of view, great story in West Papua, where vast numbers of people, this occupied territory in the South Pacific, occupied by Indonesia. There's a Suharto dictatorship there, and it was moving, with the help of the World Bank and the US and the UK government, hundreds of thousands of people from the inner islands to the outer islands to sort of turn them into a great sort of anti-communist redoubt by having the right kind of people in place. And the consequences were devastating for the indigenous people, for the forests, for the people who were being moved. And no one had properly covered this. And I'd come across this thinking I was going to make a radio series about it, but when it was obvious that the BBC wasn't going to do that, I left and sold the idea to a publisher instead.
And you were there for how long?
So 6 months. We had to walk. I went with my friend Adrian Arbib, a photographer. We had to walk across the entire island in order to get to where we wanted to be, which took weeks. We got lost in the forest. We ended up eating rats and snakes and stick insects. I got stung into a poison coma by hornets. We got swept down a mountain river.
At the age of what, 24 is this?
24, yeah.
Wow.
But somehow we came out the other side, after the most extraordinary adventures. And so I wrote those up in the context of sort of uncovering the really horrible stuff that we discovered as a sort of investigative travel book called Poisoned Arrows, and that did all right. And on the basis of that, I then went to the Amazon and did the same thing for 2 years there, getting into a phenomenal amount of trouble again, getting shot at, getting beaten up, getting shipwrecked, and all sorts of exotic and fascinating illnesses and parasites. But again, having a remarkable time uncovering some really nasty stories. And then I went to East Africa to do the same thing. Again, lots of trouble. I was pronounced clinically dead at one point. It was a misdiagnosis, but with cerebral malaria. So, I was sort of facing some fundamental fears which I wanted to see down, but I almost deliberately threw myself into the line of danger.
And you were almost tooling yourself up for life with what we know you for, which is this always the concern for the person who doesn't have the voice. But then I see you actually got into trouble in Britain because you were protesting against a road and someone roughed you up.
Yes. I was at Salisbury Hill outside Bath. It was part of this government road scheme under the John Major government, where they were basically building motorways by stealth. They were saying to all these communities, "Oh, we'll build you a bypass. Oh, when you next, we'll build you a bypass." And suddenly you realise they're trying to link up a 3-lane motorway all the way, in this case, from the M4 to Southampton. And we were saying, well, this is insane. This is not the way to run a transport policy, and it's not got consent and stuff. So we were putting ourselves in physically in the way of this. And I got picked up by these two goons in yellow tabards who dragged me across the ground and then threw me onto this pile of metal fencing which was about to be erected with these spikes on top. And one of them missed my neck by a millimetre, but another one went through the top of my foot right the way through and bust the middle metatarsal bone. It's quite a spectacular x-ray, lots of little sort of spikes, little shards of this bone. But I got stitched back up together, and I was back on the road protest within a week with my foot in plaster.
And now you write for The Guardian and you talk about the things that are closest to your heart. I know climate change is one. I've seen you doing fracking, all kinds of stuff. When people say to you, what do you care most about? Do you have an answer?
I feel it's all connected. I mean, one of the fundamental ecological principles is beautifully expressed by the great conservationist John Muir. He said, if you try to pull out anything in the universe by itself, you'll find that it's hooked to everything else. And, while I started mostly as an environmentalist, you can't detach the human dimension from it. That basically, if you're trashing the living planet, you're trashing the lives of people as well. So I don't see any hard borders there. In a way, if you care about one thing, you've got to care about everything else, because you can't unhook those things from each other.
But you could be, at this point now in 2018, you could be profoundly cynical about human beings, because we, after all we know and all we've done, we get to 2008, we engineer the biggest financial crash imaginable, and that suggests that whether or not we should be good people, we're not.
Well, I'm pessimistic about what we do, but I'm optimistic about what we are. And I think we're often pushed into doing things which we all know are stupid. I mean, how many people thought the behaviour of the financial sector leading up to the financial crisis was a sensible way to conduct our affairs? Very few people. There might have been a few people without those capacities for human kindness and cooperation who did all that, the credit default swaps and the crazy derivatives and all the rest of it. But the great majority of people, we just look at that and say, that's crazy, selfish, stupid behaviour. But we get pushed into this by a few dominant people. And I think what we've got to discover in ourselves is that altruism and cooperation, and not be embarrassed about it, not be shy about it, and say, wait a minute, these people are taking us for a ride. They're telling us that the way they behave is a human norm, but it's not. It's completely weird, and it's actually seen by most people as disgusting. So we've got to be brave enough to stand up and say, no, that's not us. And we're going to define ourselves by what we really are, but not by what they tell us what we are. And we're going to build a politics around that self-definition.
But it doesn't seem to be happening at the moment.
It is not yet. And, there's things often are going in the wrong direction, not least because when we're told that politics isn't the right forum for change, but it's the market which is the right forum to change. Only the market should be allowed to operate, and civic life and politics are an illegitimate sphere. Then if politics can't change social outcomes for people, people give up on it, and then they turn to a sort of anti-politics, demagogues, slogans, symbols, sensations, which is why it's a new age of the demagogue. Not just Trump, but Modi, Erdogan, Orban, Duterte, all around the world. These, I think, very dangerous people are rising up, and people are latching on to them because they're saying, oh, we're apart from all this politics. We're not interested in all that meaningless argument and debate and stuff. We're just going to make you feel good and tell you you're the dominant people and you can stamp on everyone else.
But isn't that funny that Trump is saying the same thing as you, which is he wants to drain the swamp? And maybe in some way your protest against politics as it is normally conducted gives Trump his voice?
Well, I mean, what I'm trying to do is to make politics work again, to actually ensure politics offers real choice, can change people's lives, can change social outcomes, because it's when it doesn't, when it fails to actually deliver that change, that's when people like Trump move in. And of course, very cynically, his draining of the swamp involves bringing all these industry representatives in to regulate their own industries. The only swamps he's drained are real ones, all these beautiful habitats like in the Everglades and stuff. Those are real swamps, but those are now in serious trouble because he's stripping away all the protections that they've got.
You've mentioned nature, the environment. I mean, you write a lot about animals, and I think we spoke once because you'd called for the return of lions to Wales.
Well, not quite. I was pointing out that lions were part of our native fauna, but that I have been calling for lynx and wolves.
Wolves to beat Scotland.
Yes, that's right. And I still want to see that happen. I'm alongside all sorts of other amazing creatures that used to live here. Pelicans. You know that pelicans are a native bird here? And the great whales we used to have in around our seas. I think this could be a much richer series of ecosystems than we have.
Do we need that as human beings?
Well, we need hope, apart from anything else. And rewilding, which is what we're talking about here, bringing back rich ecosystems and missing species, is a positive environmentalism. Half the time environmentalists are saying, follow us and the world will be slightly less crappy than it would otherwise be, which isn't exactly a stirring slogan, but follow us and things could be a lot better than they are at the moment. We could have something much richer, more fascinating, more engaging. And, in any campaign, an ounce of hope is worth a ton of despair.
Thank you very much indeed. That's George Monbiot. It'll be available on the BBC Radio 2 website. So good to see you, George. What makes us human? Discussing what makes us who we are.